The War of 1812 is a fascinating conflict by the sheer disregard by which both parties fought it. The US hadn't prepared their military for any conflict, let alone a military invasion of a landmass as large as Canada. The British, meanwhile, were still focused on Napoleon in Europe, and largely did the minimum to defend their Canadian holdings, far from bringing the entire might of the British Empire down on the Americans. By the end of the war, both sides claimed victories, sparking debate to this very day about who really won, as the concluding treaty changed very few borders, nor granted any significant non-territorial stipulations. Generally, it can be attributed as one of the more pointless wars in history. But if it was so pointless, why did it even take place at all? Well, for a deeper reading, I would suggest watching this video by the Counterfactor, linked at the end. But, to summarize, the biggest reason was the economy. The Napoleonic Wars were having massive effects on the US. Both Britain and France were aiming to restrict US trade to their rival, in hopes of wearing the other party down into capitulation. Of course, such restrictions were taking their toll on the US economy. Another major factor was that Britain required many sailors to man the Royal Navy against France, and thus they started kidnapping American sailors, forcing them to serve on the Royal Navy, a practice known as impressment, which beyond illegal was obviously very humiliating for the young US. Then, some other cited reasons include British support for the natives in the Northwest Territory, where London had ambitions to create a native buffer state to restrict US expansionism. And indeed, conversely, some in the US coveted territorial expansion into Canada. But it should be noted that consensus amongst historians is that these were, at best, secondary goals for either. For the US, the focus was on their economic concerns and on matters of national prestige. And for the British, the focus was on defending Canada. US Congress had refused to pass a bill resolving to annex British America, and several cabinet members and congressmen alluded to the idea of capturing Canada in order to use it as a bargaining chip, returning it to Britain in exchange for concessions in terms of trade. Now that is not to say there weren't any expansionists. The appeal of Canada did exist, but they weren't necessarily the majority in cabinet and Congress, and they did not necessarily want all of Canada. It is important to remember more than 3 decades had passed since 1776, when the idea of unifying all of British America into the US was far more mainstream. It was then hoped Canada would join voluntarily, while the US had been little more than a loose confederation of sovereign states, while by 1812 it was an established federation. Also, the US had been in a far more desperate struggle in 1776, and even went as far as considering compromise with the Catholic Quebecois as long as it meant defeating the British. The War of 1812 was different. This was not a war of existence. A loss did not mean the end of the American Revolution. The Canadian population had more than tripled in these decades, with most of this growth coming from British loyalists fleeing the success of the American Revolution. While some still hoped, it seemed increasingly less likely Canada would voluntarily join the US. American leaders thus had 2 choices regarding the territory. Occupy it, which would be difficult and potentially costly, especially with the lack of a federal army, or allow the Canadians to join the US as equals, which many feared could weaken the US by allowing British elements in. Simply put, interest in annexing Canada had declined, and it was not inherently a core American war goal. That is, potentially, with a single exception: the territory of Upper Canada, roughly the area of the modern province of Ontario. While today this is by far the most populated region, this was far from the case in 1812, when it was still far less densely settled than the Canadian coast was, thus becoming a more attractive target for integration. Beyond that, the region gave Britain easy access to supply aid to the natives of the Northwest, and it straddled the shoreline of the Great Lakes, which aside from Mississippi, was the most important lifeline of American commerce. For most expansionists, should all of Canada prove to be out of the question, the focus should be on just this region of Canada. So in conclusion, American goals in the war can broadly be summarized as the desire to expand American national honor and sovereignty, proving that the state can stand up to the British while ending injustices such as impressment. Beyond that, economic restrictions imposed by Britain were to be repealed. To achieve this, the occupation of Canada would have given the US a great bargaining chip, as annexing Canada wouldn't be more valuable than the economic concessions they could extract from Britain. This was actually a strategy we have seen other times in history as well, perhaps most notably with France attempting several times to capture British Hanover to exchange it for colonial gains elsewhere. While there had been debates on the annexation of Canada, the consensus seemed to be that economic considerations trumped major expansionism, and if the US demanded both Canada and economic concessions, the Americans would lose all of their leverage over London. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. With that preamble, today we will explore a world in which the US had actually won the War of 1812. We will cover two scenarios. First, I will focus on what I consider to be the more historically plausible route, which has the US achieve their diplomatic goals and only focus on minor territorial gains, exploring how just this may already affect the continent going forward. Then, I will shortly discuss a full annexation of Canada as well, with a focus on the military and political pitfalls this may cause. That of course leads us to the question of how the US may have won. For the most part, such military matters don't really interest me, and usually this is done by letting the US build a competent federal army before the war, rather than relying on state militias. The problem with this, however, is that the Democratic Republicans preferred a smaller federal government, and had in years prior actually reduced spending on the army and navy. The Federalists, who generally preferred a larger government, were opposed to this war. Thus, Madison's White House would need to completely change their political stance on this matter. This, however, was unlikely due to the very nature of the war, since the idea was mainly to scare a Britain who was already distracted by a massive war in Europe. Investing in a larger military was considered superfluous for this goal, so rather I'd prefer a smaller change, which avoids having to change fundamentals of US political parties. For example, Canada's defense had relied in no minor way on the efforts of Isaac Brock. He stood up against George Prevost, the Governor General of British North America. Prevost favored the defense, mostly focusing on Quebec and the coast, and there was a real concern the British may just abandon Upper Canada to the Americans. Yet, Brock rallied his forces, ignoring Prevost, appealing for aid wherever he could, forming militias. He then played a key role in forming an alliance with the native leader Tecumseh, and together they went on the offensive and captured Detroit, dealing a big blow to US morale, closing a major avenue of attack on Upper Canada, and seizing the initiative in the conflict. Removing this key figure from the equation, for whatever reason, be it death, reassignment, or whatever else, this could easily have put Upper Canada on the back foot. Should Prevost indeed commit to his defense of the East, we could easily see large part of Upper Canada fall under American control without all too fundamental changes. Of course, for more comprehensive victories, this won't do, and we would simply have to resort to either the US just wins, or indeed more fundamental military reforms for the US. Either way, such occupations combined with pre-existing American victories, may put the US into a more advantageous position for peace negotiations. So we now need to discuss the historical treaty, including the eternal debate on whether or not a side actually won the war. First, the arguments in favor of the US winning. In a way, the status quo being preserved was already a victory for the US, as they had stood up once again against the most powerful empire in the world, even winning a number of key battles. American confidence and prestige had risen as a result, and they had proven they weren't a pushover. At least to some extent, this may have contributed to the lack of British interference with American expansionism and the absence of another conflict. The Americans also dealt a heavy blow to native resistance in the Northwest, while the British abandoned ideas of a native confederacy. Finally, British interference with US trade and their policy of impressment had ended, which had been the primary causes of the conflict. But Britain had equally strong counter-arguments. Most notably, Britain had been the defender, so they have even more reason to claim a status quo as a victory. While I, in hindsight, have expressed my skepticism about American ambitions to conquer Canada in this war, within Britain, it was most definitely assumed that this was the primary American goal, which had thus been thwarted. Then, while it is true that impressment and interference with US trade ended, this wasn't necessarily because of the war, let alone American successes, but rather primarily because Napoleon had been defeated, and thus any reason for these anti-French measures had passed. Nothing in the treaty forced the UK to stop, and nothing would prevent them from restarting them if they so wished. It just was no longer necessary. Now, I don't think it is all too interesting to pick a side. For me, I'm more than happy to just call it a draw, but feel free to consider whichever arguments weigh more heavily to you. What matters most to me is how flexible the peace treaty was, and what the US could have achieved in a more clear-cut victory. There are three core angles to discuss. First, territorially. Of course, depending on the level of victory, all of Canada is an option, but only Upper Canada is more likely. There's also Spain, which had historically joined the war on the side of Britain and had already lost Western Florida. But further concessions could be plausible. Economically, the US may have pushed for more concrete promises by Britain for recognition of economic sovereignty and future non-involvement. As mentioned, these were in practice already scrapped post-war, but getting it written down would cement the US victory. In a simpler way, the British, in practice, already dropped the natives post-war, but nothing had forced them to. It was more so a matter of changing British priorities and the reality on the ground. Here too, the US may attempt to extract a more concrete commitment from the British. So, depending on just how much leverage the US had, those are the three angles where they can attempt to extract further concessions. Exactly how much of them they get depends on how well the war goes, and chiefly, how much the US does or doesn't occupy. For example, if they occupy all of Upper Canada and decide to demand it in the peace deal, that leaves little reason for Britain to then concede on other matters. On the whole, I would expect the changes to the treaty to be relatively modest. On the economic front, Britain will likely compromise the least. Their power comes from their trading network and economy, and they will hesitate to give that threat up, even if there is no current need for it. If Upper Canada is indeed occupied, it may well be ceded to the US, which then implicitly or explicitly also ends any British support for natives which the British can no longer reach. On the whole, the effects of the treaty are likely rather similar as in our timeline, except Upper Canada passes to the US. This means that all of this results in a far more subtle alternate history than you may have initially imagined. The nation most affected is undeniably Canada. As mentioned before, In 1815, Upper Canada wasn't that important, while it was actually Lower Canada, including Quebec, which held more than half of the Canadian population. This is also why Britain may be willing to give Upper Canada up. But in 1851, a few decades later, Ontario had become the most populous province, and from there, their relative dominance has mostly grown. Tearing the province away therefore removes a lot of Canada's potential. The remaining British territories each have significant problems. The East is very hospitable, but too small. Quebec has the most potential, but due to their Catholic, Francophone majority, they will resist too much Anglo migration into their land. While the West is both rather cold in many areas and rather difficult to reach without transportation routes which, mostly, run through the territories the US has now seized historically. There are still connectors to the west, mainly through the Nelson River into Lake Winnipeg and the Saskatchewan and Assiniboine river systems, but it will be more difficult and more costly to make populous colonies here. And even if you do, the separation between East and West Canada will grow even more stark. This also leads us to ventures further west, notably the jointly claimed Oregon Territory. This joint claim came about after settling the western US-Canada border as a straight line. In the decades following, both sides were allowed to settle this territory, with a compromise eventually reached at the 49th parallel. In this timeline, where Britain may struggle more with power projection in the west, it is far from implausible that, at some point, the Oregon dispute resolves largely in favor of the United States, further restricting Canada. In extreme cases, and I wouldn't put too much stock into this, the US may even start probing the British to buy the Hudson Bay territory. Though I would expect the British, even just on principle, to oppose such ideas. Still, it is a possibility. All of this leaves us with a very interesting potential that Canada, very plausibly, doesn't even exist in this timeline. The Confederation of Canada was founded in 1867 by unifying Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. In this union, Quebec and Ontario were not too far off, but Anglos definitely held the majority. But were you to remove Ontario, Quebec would be the center of such a union, and I doubt that the maritime provinces would be open to something that seems like Francophone domination. I think it is quite possible we see British America remain disunited, similar to how Newfoundland only joined Canada in 1949 and had remained separate up until that point. If I had to guess, we may see Quebec gain autonomy, the Maritimes confederate separately, and Newfoundland and the West both remaining separate from either. Then the next key point. Do US politics change all too immensely? Well, it seems unlikely. Carving out one state would make it rather large, so I'd expect the peninsula to become a state first, with the less populated West added as a state at a later time. I'd expect the peninsula to become a state at around the same time as Michigan, or alternatively, at around the time of Indiana, Illinois, Alabama and Mississippi. Yet, I have looked at elections between 1820 and 1856, and there is not a single one in which the 3 to 5 electoral votes of Upper Canada could have altered who became president. Likewise, while butterflies are possible, there doesn't seem to be an immediate switch in the Congress from the addition of one more northern free state. That being said, there was an effort to keep the balance between free and slave states during the 20s and 30s. This one extra free state may not be so monumental that it is impossible for the South to accept, but it would likely have to be included in one of the many compromises of the time, thereby either causing the creation of a new slave state, or its entry into the Union is delayed until a suitable slave state counterpart is found. Regardless, this one state is unlikely to, by itself, spark either an extreme response from the South, nor does it cause a radical empowerment of the North. That then leads us to discuss the US-Mexico War. There seemed to be little reason to believe that the US would, in this timeline, refuse the annexation of Texas, and the war that resulted from it. Here, there is some argument to be made that, with the success in the 1812 war, the US may reform its military a bit less, and is therefore a weaker force during this conflict. Yet, even as far as that analysis may hold up, the military balance was so extreme that it seems unlikely to make a massive difference overall. At least the North is absolutely unholdable for Mexico, and the only viable improvement for them is that they hold out for longer and give the Americans more of a bloody nose in the deeper invasions. Then, their only real hope would be an anti-war Whig winning 1848, before the war has even ended. But even then, it would be political suicide for them not to demand much of northern Mexico in exchange for peace. More plausibly though, I do expect the Americans to win in a similar way and have Mexico at their mercy. The question is then, would the US seize more territory than they did historically? This is absolutely plausible. Mexico had no way to resist, and how much the US takes mostly demands on internal US politics. Historically, many different proposals were considered for Mexico, and depending on how much better the US does regarding Canada, may influence their decision here. Of course, we already have the 2 additional future free states in Upper Canada. But if the Oregon Territory is indeed fully American as well, which to be fair is not guaranteed, that means there is at least another future free state in the West as well. This would threaten to tip the previously mentioned balance even more than historically. Aside from proposals to divide Texas, this war represents the final opportunity for the South to try and restore some balance in the Senate, and congressional Democrats may push for even further concessions from Mexico. Based on some historical proposals, we may see the US take something along these lines, creating a US that looks something like this. Though obviously, the specifics are impossible to predict for certain. And by that point, we are already running up against the conclusion of this first scenario. The US is likely to be larger at the expense of both of its neighbors, but I doubt we have done enough to fundamentally change the dynamics of the slavery debate. I do not believe the Civil War has been avoided by any of these changes, beyond completely unpredictable butterflies. Likewise, there is no reason to believe the South would fare in any way better, nor any specifics about the post-war recovery. By this point, continuing the scenario any further does not really offer any interesting analysis, but it's safe to say that, if anything, the American path towards becoming the most powerful state in the 20th century is only strengthened. There is just one final thing I want to discuss: the question of whether a third US-UK war is now more likely. And for the most part, I think the historical reasons there wasn't such a third war still apply here. That being, for much of the 1800s, the British Empire remained far more powerful than the US, with a more powerful global navy, tight control over global trade, and several times the industrial output of the US. This heavily discouraged the US from starting any conflict unless there was a good reason, and capturing Canada didn't qualify as a good enough reason. As for Britain, the War of 1812 had ended any hope of containing US expansion on the North American continent, and obviously, reintegration was purely fantasy by this point. With those 2 factors, Britain had lost much of their reason to oppose the US, so long as the US didn't start the conflict themselves. Functional trading relations became more important than desperately trying to resist US hegemony in North America, and there were other colonial ventures which took up more attention. So, for the most part, I do expect these predictions to hold true, especially over the long term. If, however, I were to predict a third war, I may expect it rather soon after the War of 1812. If the Americans get a massive boost of confidence, and the war hawks do indeed begin to increasingly muse about a full conquest of Canada. I still judge the odds of this very low, but it is not totally impossible. Still, with the lack of major wars in Europe, I doubt the Americans will find a window to make it happen. And if the US does attack a Britain that is completely free to focus on the US, then it should be clear it is highly unlikely the Americans pull out a victory. So, this is where we will leave this first scenario. Now, let us go back in time and entertain the idea of the US taking all of Canada, despite my prior objections. Now, for the most part, there is no real way to justify this. The American military just wasn't prepared for such an operation, the Democratic Republicans didn't want to invest in an army, and even if the US was miraculously successful, once France was defeated, the British may well stage a reconquest of Canada anyways. The question would then mainly become, does Britain care enough to drag out the conflict to reconquer Canada? Because as I keep saying, if Britain wants to, they wipe the floor with the US. So, for the Americans to be successful here, a lot needs to happen. They need to invest and prepare a good army before the war. They need to actually be successful in overrunning most of Canada. Initial British reconquest attempts must fail, and once Napoleon falls, British leadership needs to decide it is not worth the effort to continue the war after exhausting themselves fighting Napoleon. While not physically impossible, this is quite the list of assumptions to make. But if, for the sake of analysis, we assume it happens anyway, British control over Canada is near fully undermined, with the exception of coastal areas which are too difficult for the US Army to reach. It is possible that, once it comes time to sign a peace deal, the British do indeed attempt to hold on to such territories, and I expect at the very least that the eastern islands remain in British hands, both because of the fisheries in this area, which were economically valuable and important for trading sailors, but also because they were the final territories that offered the UK a position to threaten the US from navally. Of course, broader continental holdings are also possible, but it may be deemed not worth it on account of the odds of sparking another invasion by the US, leaving such territories as not worth defending. Either way, this is a diplomatic disaster for Britain, and has the potential to radically change the diplomatic landscape post-war. Now the main question will be Britain's to answer, and it is whether they decide to care about the loss of Canada. And if so, do they care to attempt a reconquest, or simply focus on revenge on the US out of principle? For example, the British maintaining a state of war and interfering with US trade could continue to greatly weaken the US economy. Britain controlled much of global commerce, and even just an unofficial embargo or massive tariffs placed on the US could greatly damage the US economy in the long term. British industry also absorbed about 50% of American exports during this period, so any continued British retaliation could greatly damage the US, especially the agricultural South. If Britain chooses to, they could easily make the conquest of the sparsely populated Canada cost far more than it would be worth for the US. Then there is also the question of how the US handles this massive new territory they now possess. Unlike most of US expansion, which was aimed at conquering and dispossessing natives, Canada, even if sparsely populated, already held a non-trivial amount of French-speaking Catholics and British loyalists. Both would, at least in the short term, present a problem for the US. Many would fear giving them representation in Congress, out of fear of UK-aligned Canadian senators. But the population also couldn't be mistreated in the same way the natives had been. For a while, Canadians may experience something similar to Puerto Rico today, where they are part of the US, but second-rate citizens excluded from federal politics. Herein, Quebec may be an exception. As the most populated Canadian territory, and the most dissimilar to the rest of the US, most suspicion was aimed at them, and there had been proposals to turn it into an autonomous US-aligned nation instead. Still, this was something the US has historically never done, and it feels more likely Quebec would instead be faced with an unusually long period of being a territory as Congress considers what to do with them. But after initial decades of resistance, eventually we would start to see the need for Canadian states to be created. With Canada's relatively small population, this wouldn't be too big of an issue for the balance of power in the House. And likewise, aside from butterflies, it is difficult to concretely see changes to presidential elections. But again, the most important issue are with the free slave state balance in the Senate. Any Canadian state added will be a free state. And for the creation of any of these early Canadian states, the South will pressure to improve their negotiating position. Herein, the South may well demand the creation of earlier slave states in the West, potentially opening up Oklahoma and Kansas to settlement earlier, with explicit desires to turn them into slave states. Alternatively, we may see things like proposals to split Florida pass the Senate. Yet alternatively, the US may settle on an even earlier US-Mexico war, perhaps intervening during the Texas Revolution in the 1830s, rather than waiting a whole decade. This may well change the dynamics of the entire war, with a completely different Congress and President, and notably with different compromises in place, possibly benefiting the South far more than the outcome which historically happened. Likewise, there would be the discussion on whether or not the military situation has changed, but overall, I do still expect the US to achieve a rather decisive victory. That is, unless diplomacy is altered to a point where such a war is made impossible. That might sound strange, but I think the odds of a US-UK war is significantly higher in this timeline than in actual history, where for the many reasons we have discussed, Britain didn't intervene against the US. On paper, that is rather strange. The rise of the US was quite comparable to rivals like Russia or the later German Empire. All three were large, powerful states with the potential to threaten British global hegemony. Yet, where Britain acted against two of these, the Americans were left on their own. Why? Well, it is a complicated story, and we don't have time to delve into the whole thing. One part of it were the lucrative UK-US trading routes, where both sides depended on the other for money. Another reason is the Monroe Doctrine, an American initiative which actually greatly benefited Britain, who were by far the biggest trading partner in all of Latin America and greatly appreciated locking the other Europeans out. But another major factor is that Canada exists. British power mainly lay in their navy and in their diplomatic power. Conflict with the US would, automatically, be forced to have a land-based angle as well, which greatly advantages the US. Much like I argued with the War of 1812 itself, this would allow the US to hold Canada hostage against Britain, rendering the war a defeat even if the naval conflict had been won. Now, in such an alternate timeline, most of these economic considerations are, of course, unchanged. Yet without their holdings in Canada, the British could still be freer in how they interact with the continent. For example, the Brits had been in communication with Texas, and they may just try to drive a wedge between Texas and the US. Alternatively, and perhaps more interestingly, whenever the US-Mexico War takes place, this may offer the ideal situation for Britain to wage the naval and economic war they may desire against the US. If Congress is sufficiently spooked by this possibility, a US-Mexico war may be avoided altogether, greatly complicating southern relations with the North due to the clear discrepancy between slave states and potential free states. Of course, all of this is speculative. It is very well possible the economic argument is still dominant. But, compared to our timeline, attempting to halt the American superpower is a lot more viable for Britain. Now, by this point, I doubt a British victory would result in major reconquests in Canada, but what it could do is entrench British involvement in Mexico to keep the Americans at bay. Of course, if this doesn't happen, the Americans will, again, have their way with Mexico. Even still, I don't expect an all too crazy degree of more land seized than in the previous scenario, though more of northern Mexico is always possible. Going much further though, runs into the issue of being rather densely populated by Mexicans, and while the US did have the larger population, integrating such a large amount of Catholic Hispanics was not something many in Congress were interested in. And besides, this would already represent more than enough extra territory for the expansion of slavery if they so desire. Now by this point, we are again running into the problem that butterflies are piling up. Yet, in both of these endings, the final unresolved question remains: slavery. In either of these cases, I highly doubt there is a stable equilibrium to be found that prevents civil war, though it is, of course, possible. Thus, in both of these timelines, an alternate civil war may represent a final opportunity for Britain to confront the US if they want to. Even in our timeline, the British did have an interest in supporting the Confederates, and without Canada, they well might. And we could end up with scenarios where, because the US seized Canada in 1812, they, decades later, end up losing the South due to British assistance, while Britain, interestingly, is more successful at halting the Americans. But, of course, if Britain does not launch such an intervention, the US would essentially be set to dominate the entire continent near fully. But for now, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you have enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.